GPT-5.6 Sol is now sitting inside a normal $20 ChatGPT subscription. It costs roughly half what Claude 5 costs for normal API work, and it beats it on several agentic coding benchmarks. But Fable still leads by more than 15 points on SWE-Bench Pro and wins several of the hardest reasoning evaluations. So the benchmarks flatly contradict each other, so I stopped reading charts and ran both of them through the same exact tools and tests. And towards the end of the video, I'll be going over the timeline drama that Anthropic has been going on with. If you want more of this honest breakdowns of AI tools that actually save your time and money, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you don't miss the tutorials and comparisons coming up next. Alright, so let's get right into it, starting with the most important thing about this whole AI debate, which is the pricing twist. Everyone keeps repeating Sol is half the price. And while this may sound true on paper, in the real world it really isn't. Here is why. For normal API work, Sol is $5 input and 30 output per million. Fable is 10 and 50. So on a typical job, 100k in, 20k out, Sol runs about $1, $10, and Fable about $2. In this case, Sol is genuinely dramatically cheaper. But the moment a Sol request crosses 272,000 input tokens, the entire request flips to long context pricing. $10 input and 45 output. Fable, on the other hand, stays flat at 10 and 50 the whole way through its million token window. See where I'm getting at? At 300k input, Sol costs about $390 and Fable about $4. At 500,000 input with 50k output, Sol is about $725 and Fable $750. At that point, the pricing gap narrows dramatically. So the honest version of the pricing debate is Sol is dramatically cheaper for normal work, but almost exactly the same price as Fable once your project crosses the long context threshold. If you are feeding it enormous code bases or document sets, do not pick Sol just because you think it's half the price. At that scale, you want to pick on quality and reliability since you're paying premium either way. And while we are killing myths, Fable's headline context advantage is gone on paper. Both APIs now sit around a million tokens with 120k output. Sol at 1.05 million and Fable at 1 million. But window size is not the same thing as retrieval quality, reasoning across the full context, or staying stable deep into a long session. Matching specs don't prove matching long context ability. That still has to be tested, and I'm going to be doing that as well. Also, note that the usable context inside the consumer apps can be lower than the API spec, so don't confuse the two. Alright, so with the pricing out of the way, let me go ahead and talk about what actually changed, starting with the access, as Sol is now included for Plus users at medium and high reasoning. This will be subject to rollout and usage limits, so it's not unlimited just because it's included. Fable's included access inside paid Claude subscriptions has been running on a promotional allowance. And as of the time of recording this video, that's scheduled to end on the 12th of July unless Anthropic extends it again. More on that later in the video, but the model is not disappearing. It moves to usage credits at standard rates and stays fully on the API. It just stops being included in your plan's allowance. Alright, so now we get to the point where I put both of these models to the test. I'm going to be upfront because I'm not going to pretend that this is a laboratory. I tested both of these models through the same products or use cases people actually need. ChatGPT and Claude for the everyday work, Codex and Claude Code for the coding. I'll be using the same prompts, same files, and starting state, and I verified the outputs myself. What I tracked was effort to a working result. How many attempts it took, how much time, how many manual corrections, and an estimated cost for you to actually get things done in that regard. We'll also be talking about whether the final thing actually worked or not. Now here's the thing that I'm not claiming. The tests that we are running will not conclusively say that one model is universally smarter. But what these tests in this video can tell you is which one gives you a better result with less hassle and for what kind of work. Maybe both of the models will give you exceptionally good results, but one will be faster, cost less, or maybe you just like their output better. That is a buyer's verdict, not a law of physics. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the first test, which is going to be a coding task. I'll be giving both the same small existing project and the same real job. Same repository state, same prompt. Each one of them will only get one run unless something broke for reasons unrelated to the model. Now you can also see the checklist right here that I'm going to grade against, so I couldn't move the goalposts afterward. This should give you a clearer idea of what actually happened once we have the results. So for the first test, I wanted something more useful than asking both models to build another calculator or a basic landing page from scratch. I gave each model the same untouched copy of a small existing Node.js application called Project Board. The application already had a clean interface, 3 active projects, a role selector, and a basic project creation and editing. But it had no archive system at all. The job was to add that feature across the entire application. Admins needed to be able to archive and restore projects, whereas members could still view everything, but the backend had to block them from performing those actions. The models also needed to add separate active and archived views, accurate counts, persistent status changes, proper error handling, and meaningful automated tests without breaking the original functionality. Here is what we got out of that test. Sol's process looked extremely convincing. It inspected the backend, persistence layer, frontend, and original tests. It edited 6 files, added a separate archive test suite, and reported that all 10 tests have passed, including the 3 original tests. The final response also claimed that it had started the application and verified everything in a live browser. According to Sol, nothing remained unverified. Once I launched the real application correctly through the server, the design loaded normally, and to be clear, the visual foundation that you're seeing came from the starter project. Sol did not create it and neither did Fable. But in Sol's case, the functionality still failed. The application shows an internal server error, the active view contained no projects, and the archived view contained no projects either. Adding a new one did nothing. The admin and member selector responded, but clicking between active and archived changed to selected view, but those were essentially surface level interactions. There was no project data behind them, so I still could not archive, restore, create, or meaningfully use anything. So this was no longer a bad launch method or missing style sheet, this was the properly running version failing to communicate with its backend. Now on the other hand, we've got Fable 5. Fable received the same untouched starter application and the same exact prompt. It also took roughly 20 minutes to complete, and then it inspected the repository, updated the backend and persistence logic, added the new front-end behavior, preserved all 3 original tests. Its final result was 15 out of 15 passing. But the much more important difference was what happened outside the test suite. Fable opened the running application and actively tested the real workflow itself. It archived an existing project and confirmed that the active count dropped. It switched to the archived view and confirmed that the project appeared there. The point is that the functionality was perfect. When I finally opened the application myself, the completion report matched reality. Adding a project worked immediately, archiving moved it into the archived view, restoring brought it back, everything moved smoothly. So in my own tests, this was a decisive Fable win. Both models had roughly the same amount of time, inspected the project, added tests, and produced extremely confident completion reports. But only one report matched reality. Now this is just one project and it doesn't prove that Fable is universally better at coding. But on this project and others that I have tested, Fable was better at implementation, integration, end-to-end verification, and dramatically more reliable about knowing whether the task was actually complete. Here is the on-screen scorecard for you to glance at for this first test. Alright, so for the second test, I moved away from coding and tested something both companies claim these models are excellent at, and that's research. Now this is where a lot of AI comparisons become useless. They put 2 reports side by side, skim the writing, and choose whichever one sounds more intelligent. But polished writing proves almost nothing. A model can produce a beautifully structured report built on sources that are dead, misquoted, commercially biased, or completely unrelated to the claims being made. So I chose a research where the evidence genuinely conflicts. Do AI coding tools measurably improve productivity for experienced software developers working on real codebases, or do they actually slow them down? This isn't a question with one obvious answer. Some controlled and field experiments report major productivity gains. Other research found experienced developers became slower while working on repositories they already understood. So that gives both models a real research challenge. They can't just find one study and repeat its headline. They need to distinguish between junior and experienced developers, toy coding exercises and mature repositories, autocomplete and autonomous agents, and more. So I will give them the same exact instructions and then I will open all of the different resources and check myself. I'm going to be checking whether the source even exists, does it actually support what the model says it supports, and third, did the model represent the evidence honestly or did it remove the limitations and turn a narrow study into a universal conclusion? So here are both results that Fable 5 and GPT-5.6 came back with. Sol Ultra took around 6 minutes and 50 seconds and returned the stronger research answer overall. It used exactly 5 sources and all 5 were original or primary research rather than recycled articles. Every link opened, the major figures checked out, and each source supported the claim attached to it. The best part of Sol's answer was the source selection. It found the newest and most directly relevant paper in the entire round. The 2026 NBER study comparing autocomplete synchronous agents and asynchronous agents across more than 100,000 developers. That paper showed a massive difference between generating more code and actually shipping more software. Sol used that distinction properly instead of blindly repeating giant productivity percentages. In all honesty, there was no meaningful factual or reasoning weakness in Sol's final answer. It was slower than Fable, almost took double the time, but the extra 3 minutes produced a much better evidence review. I would definitely grade it a 10 out of 10. Now Claude Fable 5 on the other hand took about 4 minutes, followed the instructions properly, and also produced an excellent report. All 5 links worked, its source selection included strong evidence from both sides. Its explanation of why the findings differed was very good. It correctly focused on developer experience, repository maturity, and all of the details I included in the prompt. But Fable made one real synthesis mistake. It said self-reports consistently overstate benefits. That is true in the METR experiment, where developers believed they were faster even though they were actually slower. But it's not consistently true. In the GitHub Copilot experiment, participants estimated a smaller improvement than the experiment measured. The accurate conclusion is that self-reported productivity can differ sharply from measured productivity in either direction. It also described 84% of developers using or planning to use AI as near universal adoption, which is too aggressive because the number includes people who only plan to use it. Those are subtle mistakes, not hallucinations. The sources themselves were real and correctly summarized. Fable's report was still highly publishable after one sentence was fixed, but I would still score it 8.5 out of 10. This was close, but Sol definitely wins the research round. Fable was faster and slightly easier to read, but Sol was more current, used a stronger fifth source, and made no meaningful interpretation error. So this was much closer than the coding test, and Sol took it in my opinion. So neither model failed by inventing a fake paper or giving bad results. At this level, the errors are more subtle, the links are real, and the statistics were mostly correct. Alright, so third, we've got the long document test. I gave both models the same pack of 10 internal company documents. Now I've made it so that the documents are messy on purpose, contain contradictions for the models to catch, identify decisions that had been replaced by newer ones, and reject any confident conclusion that the documents did not actually support. This was supposed to test whether a model can actually track dates, authority, and context across a messy project folder instead of just summarizing each file separately. I also wanted to see whether either model would confuse things that only looked contradictory. For example, 2 different prices could both be valid for different customers, or 2 retention periods could apply to different types of data. So the challenge was not just finding mismatched words or numbers, it was understanding what was current, what was outdated, and what was still unresolved. Additionally, in my prompt, I never told either model that the documents would contain a set number of contradictions or errors. I just gave it everything and made it decide what to do with it. In Sol's case, it completed the audit in around 4 minutes. It correctly reconstructed approved plan, it found the outdated launch date, incorrect geography, wrong pricing, outdated retention policy. All of the contradictions were spotted perfectly. It also correctly challenged the board's claim that the product was ready for a broad North American enterprise rollout. Canada was still blocked, enterprise testing was incomplete, 24/7 support was not approved, and one of its best findings was that a required tenant deletion check appeared in earlier launch documents but disappeared from the latest risk register without any record that it had been actually completed. Sol did not invent an answer, it flagged the gaps. Once all 10 files were successfully processed, the audit itself was excellent. In my opinion, the answer quality score for this kind of test is definitely a 10 out of 10. Now, Claude Fable 5 handled the full document pack correctly on the first attempt and returned its answer in around 3 minutes. It reconstructed the same approved launch plan and caught all of the same major contradictions and superseded decisions. It correctly explained that a later sales document was still outdated because its content had been frozen before the final executive decisions. Similar to Sol, it caught the missing tenant deletion closure and refused to assume that the silence meant the requirement had been completed. There were absolutely no meaningful factual or reasoning problems in any of their answers. The answer quality for Fable 5 is also a 10 out of 10 for this test. So on the actual reasoning, this was actually a tie. Both models found the important contradictions, tracked the decision history correctly, avoided the deliberate traps, and reached the right recommendation out of 10 full documents. One small difference that makes Claude pull ahead in my opinion was the workflow. If you try uploading files to Claude, it will process all of the documents no matter how many almost immediately and completed the task correctly on the first attempt with less time. ChatGPT work took longer to process the same pack. It even failed to read 2 valid files on my first attempt and required a fresh session and complete re-upload of all 10 documents before Sol could perform the full audit. Once the files were available, Sol was just as good. The final result would be reasoning quality is tie, but workflow winner would be Fable 5. Now that matters a lot, especially if you are working with large documents, a lot of files, and you're constantly uploading them into the session. If any of the platforms or models fails to read the actual documents, you'd be wasting some of your time and even credits. Finally, as a bonus, we're going to be talking about design. This is not going to be another controlled benchmark because design is subjective, and I had already seen enough from both models to know that giving them one dashboard and declaring a winner would not tell the whole story. Instead, I went through public builds people had shared on different platforms to see what both models were capable of when creators pushed them toward games, animations, websites, 3D graphics, and more experimental visual work. Now you want to take this with a grain of salt because people post their best results, prompts are rarely identical, and some examples use extra tools or additional iterations, so I'm not treating this as a win rate comparison. This is more about the ceiling. What can these models actually visually create when somebody has a strong idea and gives them room to work? Now, one of the best direct comparisons gave Sol and Fable the same job to build a travel website for a trip to Japan. Sol produced a polished site with an animated 3D Torii gate as the main visual element. Fable also created a strong alternative using animated snowfall. You can see for yourself and see which one did it better, but the creator's conclusion was that GPT-5.6 had closed much of the front-end design gap. Sol is clearly no longer a model that you only use for back-end work or plain functional interfaces. It can generate genuinely impressive visual experiences. Some extreme examples went far beyond websites, as one creator showed a voxel-based Manhattan simulation with a functioning subway system alongside a destruction-style game. Other examples showed shader animations, large enemy systems, interactive 3D characters, and WebGL-heavy scenes. That seems to be where Sol is especially interesting visually. It is very good at taking a technically ambitious idea, 3D environments, simulation, motion, and stuff like that, and turning it into something you can actually interact with. The trade-off is that some of them still feel more like impressive technical demonstrations than completely refined products. Fable's builds are equally ridiculous, but they often feel different. Developers have used it to regenerate games in a single extended generation, including the maps, creatures, battle interface, movement, stats, and other connected systems. That doesn't mean that the results were automatically production ready, but it demonstrated an ability to maintain a coherent visual and functional direction across a surprisingly large build. So after all of that, here is the honest conclusion. As you've seen in the coding test, Fable won decisively. Both models had the same project, the same prompt, and roughly the same 20-minute working time. Fable delivered a fully functional result on the first attempt, tested it properly, and extended the existing design in a way that felt intentional. Sol produced a convincing report and passing internal tests, but the actual application still returned server errors, failed to load projects, and could not complete the main workflow. That one was not really close. In research, Sol won, but narrowly. Both produced excellent reports with 5 real sources and no fabricated papers. Fable finished it faster, but it made one overly broad interpretation about self-reported productivity. In the long document test that we ran, the actual reasoning was a tie. Once ChatGPT successfully processed all 10 documents, both models found every major contradiction, tracked the superseded decisions, challenged the unsupported launch claim, and reached the correct recommendation. And then as you saw visually, both models are clearly capable of ridiculous work. From the public games, websites, 3D scenes, simulations, and interactive builds people have shared, both models appear very strong. Now, there is no clear winner in the design element because that is subjective. Neither model overwhelmingly destroys the other in terms of design. So the question you all came for, which one do I think is actually better? Personally, I really like Fable 5. Based on hours of testing and everything I have seen people build with it, I think it is by far the best model that we have received so far. When I give a model a difficult task, I do not only want intelligence, I also want judgment. I want to know when the result is actually finished and for it to be consistent with that. catch the details I did not explicitly spell out, test its own assumptions, and produce something I do not immediately have to repair. In all of those aspects, Fable 5 feels so amazing. So yes, Fable 5 is my personal winner, but am I saying that you should only use Fable 5 or never use Sol? The answer is no, absolutely not. Sol still produced amazing research answer once it successfully received the full document pack. Its long context reasoning was every bit as good as Fable's. It's highly competitive visually, performs extremely well across agentic workflows, and costs far less for ordinary API usage. And more importantly, Sol is much easier for most people to access. It is available through eligible Plus, Pro, Business, and Enterprise plans, as well as Codex, ChatGPT work, and the API. Fable remains much more expensive through the API, and its included subscription access has been treated as a temporary promotional allowance rather than a stable everyday entitlement. If you are running hundreds or thousands of API calls, Sol's price advantage is enormous. If you already pay for ChatGPT Plus, Sol is sitting inside a product that you probably use every single day. And if the quality difference on your specific workload is small, paying roughly twice as much in lower context for Fable makes no sense. Fable doesn't need to win every single category to be the better model in my opinion, and Sol does not need to be the absolute best model to be the smarter purchase for most people. So Fable wins if budget does not matter to you and you want the absolute best answer possible, but Sol should win the default position. Now we're talking about all of that, and we're not even talking about the Fable 5 drama. The timing around this comparison makes the whole thing even more ridiculous. Anthropic originally launched Fable 5 on June 9, and then a few days later on June 12th, access was suspended after a US government directive restricted the model's availability to foreign nationals. The restrictions were lifted and Anthropic announced that Fable would return globally on July the 1st. When it came back, it included stricter safeguards, and then they said they would pull it back on July 7th and then extended it to include access until July 12th. And then they extended it again at the same timing that GPT 5.6 was released publicly. Now, can I prove that Anthropic extended Fable because GPT 5.6 arrived? No. But releasing your best model, removing it, returning it with stricter safeguards, preparing to push it behind expensive usage credits, and then watching OpenAI launch a much cheaper competitor was not exactly relaxing. Moving Fable behind credits at that exact moment would have been a self-inflicted disaster. So Anthropic extended it as most people expected them to. That means Anthropic is not yet cooked. Fable is still exceptionally good, users still clearly want access to it, and based on my many tests, the premium is not imaginary. The model can genuinely justify the higher cost on difficult work. But Anthropic's access strategy has been chaotic, and they cannot keep treating their best model like a limited time event forever. At some point, users need to know whether Fable is an actual product they can build their workflow around or a model they get to borrow until the next deadline moves again. I know it's available as an API key, but still. OpenAI's advantage is not that Sol destroys Fable on quality, it never did. OpenAI's advantage is that Sol is close enough in quality, significantly cheaper in normal use, and far easier for the average person to access consistently. Even as an API key, you get to decide how much of the effort you want included, whereas in Fable 5, you really can't. As I covered in a previous video, you get access to Luna, Terra, and then Sol. But in Fable 5's case, it's just Fable 5. So honestly, that combination of Sol is just way too hard to beat. Let me know which tasks you think I should run through both models next and which one you prefer so far. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you have found it to be helpful or informative to watch, let me know by giving it a thumbs up, and definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel if you don't want to miss out on any tests, comparisons, or tutorials in the AI space similar to this one.